As they say in public radio, we're back. I'm
Okay.
Michael Steinman, Jazz Lives. This is IRV KRATKA, who says he has more stories, and I am as excited as a Maltese Terrier puppy.
I love Maltese. I once had a Maltese. In conversation, in discussing some of the people you mentioned, I went back to the beginning of the Music Minus One company. My first recordings were rhythm sections, and I utilized Nat Pierce, who I'd read about in Downbeat as being the Count Basie stylist, and Mundell Lowe on guitar, Milt Hinton on bass, and O.C. Johnson on drums. And that was a wonderful recording. And then I went to a second session and a third session. The second session was again with different pianists.
Don Abney, maybe.
Abney, exactly right. And Kenny Clark on drums, and Pettifoot on bass, and not Mundell, but
Barry Gale Goldberg, maybe.
Goldbreath, in fact, was on the first, and Mundell was the second, I believe. In any case, an interesting anecdote of that was that on the song Poor Butterfly, Pettifoot was trying to work out his solo. And the concept of the record is you play as rhythm for people singing or playing along. And there would be solo interludes to make it feel like an actual recording, not just where you participate, nothing ever else happens. And he was going to do a 16-bar solo. And he's working at it, and Kenny Clark turned to him and said, Oscar, it's just jazz. Let's get on with it, man. And Pettifoot stared at him. And Pettifoot had a terrible temper. I mean, he would knock you down as soon as he talked to you. At a very... And Kenny just shrilled up at the drum set. He just looked down and nothing more was said. And while he worked out the solo, which took maybe another 15 minutes, but it was a gorgeous solo. It sounds like he's playing a giant guitar instead of a bass fiddle. It's beautifully done. So that was one of the things I remember particularly. I met an arranger, a gentleman named Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. Perk had studied or been involved with Quincy Jones at one point, and he was at one of these sessions, and he said, "Why don't you use a horn?" I was intrigued with the idea, so my fourth album was a Gershwin album, and we brought in Joe Wilder to play. Well, Joe Wilder just turned me inside out. I'd never heard anyone with such focused ideas in playing and such orderly style and great ideas. Great, just an exceptional player. And I don't think I used him on my Cole Porter, which was followed, but I can't remember at this point. But it's a wonderful recording of Joe Wilder on this Gershwin album. And Perkinson subsequently went to Europe on my behalf to record Bach for Music Minus One. And I was amused at the idea that here he enters as a 6'3" tall black gentleman to conduct a German orchestra. It was right after the war. And I'm thinking in my mind, I would have wanted to be a fly on the wall to see what they said and what their response was to this gentleman coming to conduct them. He came back with wonderful recordings, so it went off well. I've lost touch with Perk. I think he's passed away, I'm not sure. But he had a good career in music. If you Google him, there's an interesting number of things he's done. So these are things I remember. Wilder stuck out in my mind. And of course, once I encountered George Duvivier on my second session, I never used another bassist. He was just so all-encompassing. Even though Pettifoot was great, Duvivier just was equal and helped the sessions go along very tremendously. And I think on the third session, I used Hank Jones on piano. So I was using the best players in the world at that time.
And these guys were beautiful improvisers, but they also had such wonderful training in the studio so that you could put music in front of them and nothing fazed them.
They didn't work for music. They did chord constructions of standards. Once Jones called out the key they were in, they walked ahead, moved ahead. It might go to him as the pianist, as the main player, to set the tempo and the feeling for the thing. But they gave me each album I did was 8 songs, and they came to sell 30, 40, 50,000 copies each, which I've never come close to on anything else I've ever done. They've been used around the world for 40, 50 years now.
Yeah, they're famous. I
Yeah.
saw them early on, and I still see them floating around. You had Joe Jones on a date, even.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So,
In fact, in one session, Roach was, I think it was the fourth session of Gershwin, and Roach hadn't come down. And DeVivier said to me, ask Hank to call Elvin. I said, Elvin Jones going to come down? He says, yeah, it's a gig, man. He'll be. And sure enough, Elvin appeared in half an hour. You know, at a session, time is money.
Yeah.
We had no drummer. He came shuffling in with his drum set, and suddenly he was substituting for Max Roach. What an experience, you know.
Yeah.
In retrospect, the idea that two of the major players in the world were on my sessions, and one didn't show up. At the time, Max had become was having a relationship. They were married with Abby Lincoln. And another funny experience I had is I met Abby. I don't remember the circumstances, and I took her to the Second Avenue Deli with my first family, and she had a ball. She enjoyed the pastrami. Not that she probably hadn't had it before, but I was always intrigued with the idea that a well-famous artist has another side, which is getting together with the common people and having pastrami
yeah,
sandwiches.
you see, these people have to eat, too.
Yeah.
You know.
So
And-
these are little incidents that stayed in my mind for many years.
And you kept the jazz aspect of Music Minus One going. It's still in this century,
Yes, yes.
because I know recordings that you've made with Hal Smith and Evan Christopher and people like
Yes.
that, and a little bit farther back a session with Doc Cheatham and Vic Dickinson and Kenny DeVerne and Dick Wellstud and Gus Johnson, and I've forgotten the bassist, and DeVivier probably.
Yeah. We used Ed Pulser on it one date, and Suit came in on a date with I think with Jane Harvey. I heard Harvey at Condon's one Sunday. She's a wonderful singer. I approached her, I said, would you do an album for me? And she said, sure. And I put together this album of Walla songs. It's one of my favorites, and it was a small band that accompanied Wellsted and
Al Casey is on that.
yeah, the original Walla guitarist. So my life has touched so many of these originals. I guess it comes with the territory of being as old as I am, but it's a wonderful experience, something I look back on.
And you seem to have had nice relationships with these people, which is
Oh yeah.
very, very fortunate. You know, if the worst thing you've told me so far this morning is Oscar Pettiford glaring, you know.
Well, that was a relationship he had with Kenny. Kenny didn't want to spend the time on the solo, and Oscar was damn well. He didn't care what it was for.
Yeah.
He was going to do it right. You know, and we were recording at Judson Hall, which became Steinway Hall, became whatever it is today. But right in the Steinway building, they had a marvelous auditorium, a good sound, good shaped room for sound. And I was up on the balcony with my engineer equipment and looking down on this, and a funny situation. So, and I recorded early on more wind quintets for my classic jazz. I had Classic Editions label where I did about 13 albums of wind music and as many albums of organ music, going up to Connecticut, the Hartford, to record the organ at Trinity Church with Clarence Waters. So my life crossed many barriers. I had many recordings. I was at the very beginning of the CD era and the compact disc era and the LP era in music. And my first recordings with 78 RPMs done at Peter Bartok's studio with Dick Hyman. My first recordings with Dick Hyman, he did I think 3 songs for me.
As Music Minus One, or
No,
just-
straight solos. In fact, he did 3 albums for me. I'm getting it wrong. He did a Kurt Weill, an Old Coward, and a Vernon Duke album, 12 songs each.
Mm.
We had a plan to do 13 albums, but it never came to fruition, but those were outstanding albums. And today he scoffs at them. He feels they're not his best efforts, but he's a perfectionist, you know.
Yeah.
In fact, funny story there. I recently decided to reissue them on CD, and he said, I would rather not. I don't think they're good work, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I got off the phone. It was sort of an inconclusive conversation. The guy said, I owned them. And I felt, gee, why should he just... I thought they were well worth listening to. He called me the next day. He said, I've been talking to my wife. And she says, and he's quote, unquote, she says, octogenarians shouldn't be fighting. He says, go ahead and put them out. I know, that stuck with me. I rather he'd be happy with saying yes to it than putting it out in the face of his saying no. Because I with F. Resnick, used to hear him in a cocktail lounge before at the start of his career. We were 17 and 18. He was about 19. And then I saw him go on to Godfrey, and he seemed to lose all of what I was interested in because he was becoming a great piano player, but a chameleon, playing everyone else's style but his own. But Effie and I spent about a year or two listening to him in a cocktail lounge, and we found we discovered the Art Tatum of our time.
Yeah. And he's still
Brilliant
absolutely
player.
amazing.
Yeah, he's a brilliant player.
At,
So my life has
at
touched these
88.
people. Yeah, with again the same age. I have them by a year. So I've just, remained in touch and used these people. And recently I encountered Glenn Zatola. And I find him to be a magnificent performer. I have some albums I want to give you today that you don't have, and you can hear them. He did a Miles tribute and some other things that are quite unique. His Clifford Brown is, I don't know if you've ever heard that.
No, I haven't.
Gorgeous evocation of the work of Clifford Brown. Just wonderful. I mean, he saw us. He literally, one of the great improvisers of our time. He had an interesting story, which I must tell you. He was working with Wilbur in the Bechet Legacy in England, and suddenly said, he had a daughter, and he wasn't seeing his daughter. She was here, and he was there. He said, I feel I got to go off the road. And he gave us notice, and Bob was very upset with that, but, it was what it was. He'd been using Randy Sankey before Glenn Zatola, and I don't know if Sankey was no longer available, but it meant the end of the Bechet Legacy as far as touring, not to have a trumpet player who knew the repertoire. Somehow or other, he got back to the States, and he went to a jam session or some sort of session with Suzanne Summers on it. And he asked her, could he sit in? He had his horn with him. There's a story he's told me, so there may be variations on it. But she said, sure. And she became absolutely enamored with his playing. She said, would you work with me? He said, well, I don't work with people. She wanted him as a band leader for her. She said, no, we'll be equals. She wanted to make that clear to him that they'd be equals. They joined, and they performed for 8 years on television. So it was seen by millions, not jazz fans, but millions of the public. And during that time, he got a job he got an office at Universal next to Spielberg's office. That was how high he ranked in their estimation. He said, when I needed reeds, I sent a kid down to the store to pick up 100 reeds and bring them back for me to be examined in my office. He says, I died and got into heaven. I was making this great money, wasn't on the road, didn't have to tour, stayed in one place and was earning very good money. So that was a terrific experience for him, but it took him away from the jazz world totally. And today he doesn't want to perform with jazz players because he feels that most of them don't play as well as he does, or in his mind. And it's not as interesting a scene, and it's probably maybe even hackneyed in terms of playing the same songs all the time. And he just felt he'd gone beyond it. So he was in the awkward situation of having retired around 60, 65, before 65. And he stopped working in jazz completely, Now, I discovered him, I think, at 66, and he's made 12 albums for me, Music Minus One and jazz recordings. The jazz recordings I've adapted to Music Minus One usage. And it's like, for him, a rebirth. He's enjoying the hell out of it. And he doesn't have to work with anybody. He's taking my existing tracks and overdubbing them. And in so doing, he can create marvelous evocations of the song more insightful than if we were jamming with a group of 3 guys, 4 guys in a front line, because he can hear the thing repetitively and work his soul around it to where it's a perfect union. He's released an album called Come Fly With Me. The very opening song is an example of that. His soul is breathtakingly beautiful, just breathtakingly beautiful. And the same in the case of the Clifford Brown, we took the Clifford Brown recordings, early string recordings, and I have a MIDI person who recreated that orchestra to fairly well. They did the Charlie Parker with Strings album for me in the last 3 weeks. And the Clifford Brown has been a wonderful experience for me. We created an actual orchestra for Glenn to play with.
I'm sure it sounds beautiful.
I'll give it to you. You can make your own judgment.
Okay. Thank you.
So where are we?
Where are we?